and the picture, and then you stand up and they take your picture,
Right.
and it does, photo recognition, picture to
Right.
picture. It took 9 tries, and then they brought 3 people over to look at me and look at the driver's license and realize it's me. But
Right.
that was me 56 pounds heavier. My whole head was different. And so
Right.
the facial recognition software was saying no.
Oh, wow.
Someone later said, you don't have to do that. I'm like, well, I know now. It's like, but at that point, I'm like, I just want to go see my mom. It's my sister.
Ah, that's not good. So they finally accepted you, though.
Yeah, but it was all on manual where the 3 people went, that's him. I said, I did lose 57 pounds with 56 pounds last year. They went, oh,
Wow.
that'll do it. So
Yeah. Okay. Well, good morning to our YouTube audience. I'm sorry to be so late. I have no decent excuse. We've been preparing for this summer storm, Blair, uh, which upstate New York would be pretty moderate, but um, around here, 5 inches of snow is enough to stop us for a week. Uh, and the reason, part of the reason is that in this part of the world, we do not have furnaces. We have heat pumps, and heat pumps are notorious um, for not getting warm fast, and so it's hard to heat up our schools. That's one issue. And the other issue is that nobody around here knows how to drive in the snow. And even in the Midwest, I see that in general, people are going way too fast because um, I, I once took a trip from Olivet, Michigan to Arapahoe Basin, Colorado in a snowstorm. And it took 36 hours to make that drive. And it took 16 hours to get across Kansas, which is 400 miles wide about. so, uh, but it was in a snowstorm, and uh, we went at 25 miles an hour, but we arrived safely. Um, I guess that was my first big experience with a vision, actually. Was so tired that at like 4 o'clock in the morning, we were passing Council Bluffs, Iowa, and I looked up to my left and I could see the Council Bluffs. And I know I couldn't see Council Bluffs. It was the weather was absolutely miserable, but anyway, I could see it. So that definitely means I had vision. And
Kansas is wild in the snow because during the day, the horizon will be lighter and blends into the snow. And
right,
so you feel like the road is the only thing in the universe and everything else just big white and blue
right. And
because it's so
the
flat.
right. This morning, the Weather Channel had a fixed camera on one overpass someplace in Kansas. I don't know where it was exactly. But the first thing they show is a semi tractor trailer that comes over it, goes off the embankment, fishtails, and the cab comes almost back up to the shoulder. The guy was very lucky he didn't flip. Um, and but then that was followed by about 10 SUVs going off that same road. And it was pretty
Wow.
pretty scary, actually. And I'm sort of waiting for a quorum here on YouTube because I want to start with um, a sad announcement, but we don't have a quorum yet. And so I'm going to wait another I'm going to fiddle around here for another minute or two to see if we get up to 10 people. And then I'll make my sad announcement. And that's probably not fair to the rest of you. So I see we're losing people. So I guess I'll make my sad announcement and move on. Okay, so I learned yet last night that one of our dear friends of this channel, Miles Flagg, has died. He died on December 30th, and his wife was kind enough to send me a notice. But Miles was a longtime um, follower of this channel. I said to Gina that he thought I was helping him through, and he was actually helping me through. And I realized it at the time, and he was a very kind man. He had served on the Canadian Pacific Railway for 30 years as an engineer, and and recently I knew that he uh, was ill, but I didn't know how ill, and it turned out that he has something called ALM, which uh, is an abbreviation for a type of leukemia that gets in the bloodstream and the bone marrow. And he apparently was really suffering from it for about the last year,
Wow.
and we hadn't really heard from him for about a year, so I'm not surprised. Um, but in any case, he finally succumbed to this illness, and so it's a very sad moment for me because Miles kept me going. He connected me up with Paul Vanderklay, um, the Methodist pastor in Sacramento, who we followed in the old days. We followed him quite closely for quite a while until we were ready to move beyond religion. And so we have done at this point, and I don't know who of our audience understands that fact, but uh, let's just talk about it for a moment, which is that religions have been uh, a psychological support for literally billions of people for the last 4 or 5 thousand years. And basically, quote unquote, medicine men or um, early prophets um, started to see patterns happening in the human species and started to find ways to deal with um, our unhappy side of life. And and ultimately, that led all religions to develop some rituals that help us pa pass through certain events of the human species. One of them, of course, is death, and it causes us uh, no end to psychological problems if we're the one left behind. And so funerals are a way for the living to come to terms with the loss of an important person in their life. Right now in the United States, we're currently passing through 6 days of mourning and funeral for President Jimmy Carter, who was very meaningful to many of us and who actually was a contemporary of my father's at the U.S. Naval Academy. He was a plebe. That meant the lowest class when my father was a senior, a first classman at the Naval Academy, and they knew each other. And my father would be 102 right now if he had survived, but he didn't. Um, and so funerals is one thing that um, the leaders of all human clans um, started to recognize as a necessary ritual to get us past the loss of an important person in our lives. And funerals appear in all of the world's religions. And another one is marriage ceremony. Of course, we have marriages in all religions, and um, that traditionally has been a time of passing uh, usually a daughter into another family, and therefore, in a way, it's a loss of a daughter, but it's also the gain ultimately of grandchildren, and so it's both a time of mourning for the daughter's family who have been with her during her growing up years, and later on, it's a time of joy when grandchildren appear on the scene, and that type joy can be extremely important, as Jung saw in Europe between the world wars. Um, the women of Germany did what was necessary to create a new generation that actually fought World War II. Um, and the Europe was decimated, lost 8 million men in World War One, and so there couldn't have been enough men around to have a traditional marriage for a lot of women, and yet a lot of women did have children. So more power to them that they regenerated their nationality, whether it was British or German men. And so the knuckleheads that got into World War One hadn't had enough, and they decided to go at it again, and we had World War II. And now a lot of us are concerned that we may be in the opening throes of another world war, because in the Middle East, things are not peaceful. And obviously, we have the Russia-Ukraine matter, which it has been a traditional battle between the Russians and Western Europe. And so that's in the balance at the moment. We'll see how it plays out after our new president is installed. And the other, of course, is the war in Gaza, which has now spilled over to the point where we shot down one of our own F-18s over the southern end of the Red Sea a few weeks ago. Um, Fortunately, both pilots survived and bailed out, but um, there's a lot of tension in that part of the world. We have a lot of major ships there, and they are escorting ships into the Red Sea and through the Red Sea. And there are people that we don't agree with who are attacking those ships, and So there's a lot of action. There's a lot of people um, shooting rockets at various people. Fortunately, most of them are not very smart in terms of their technology, and so they're rockets, not guided missiles for the most part. But and we see that when some of Iran's proxies fired something like 1,500 missiles at Israel about a year ago, and they all got shot down. And so there's obviously a gap in technology there. But we're in a very precarious moment. We're in the process of reliving the 20th century, it seems, except that now, um, for the most part, we've lost the support of religion we can, um, unless we can uh, see it as Jung saw it. And if we see it as Jung saw it, then we can understand what these rituals do for us and what the weekly church service does for us as a kind of um, therapy, I would say. And it makes Jung's work all the more important for us. And so I'm going to shut up and let Jordan comment on any of that.
I'm systematically staying out of all the proxy wars. I mean, who gives who what, and then the person who received the what shoots someone else. And the fact that point the finger one way or the other. And the
Yeah.
technology piece is, I'll just say the technology piece is great. So we have higher technology weapons, so we can more accurately shoot down our own things. I mean, so instead of shooting down someone else's missiles, we shoot down our own planes. And I mean,
Yeah.
granted, mistakes happen, but it just reminds me of in this was in the 60s. NORAD had a 99.9% prediction that Russia had launched nuclear weapons, but it's the computer just mistakenly read the sunrise over Siberia as missiles launching. And when you realize that kind of mistake, that, oh, why'd you go to war? Sunrise. So it's like,
Yeah.
you gotta, this whole how to vet whatever. And I'm trying to stay as much of an observer. Also too, I mean, the media is, we don't have was it the Smith-Bunt Act or Truth in the Media that was repealed? I mean, so many things we see are just to turn our heads one way and miss something the other way. So I can't really speak with any intelligent position about all the warring policies and things that are going on. I mean, I kind of look at all of it and I see a bunch of kids on the playground bullying each other.
Yeah, we're adolescents. The human species is adolescent in its development. That's clear. And we Jung used to talk about it in terms of, in times of peace, plan for war type thing. And the problem is we have to get off that teeter-totter. And it's going to take several hundred years more probably in order to achieve that.
Yeah, I'd rather be a gardener, a warrior in a garden than a gardener in a war, But at the same time, I look even at my martial arts background, and I don't have thoughts of going around kicking a bunch of butt. I just, in fact, if anything, I diminish conflicts. And it's
Yeah.
not being afraid of conflict, but it's I can see things happening, and I know the little triggers and who throws what punch first, why, and I can step in
Yeah.
and mediate. And I think what happens is when people's emotions get the best of them that way, they they don't really play the um, one word of anger can cause a year of anguish kind
Yeah.
of thing. And if you can take that anger and that volcanic activity and put it in the gas tank, use it for motivation, use it for fuel. But there's the whole alchemical process. Take that Negretto and burn it white hot to calcinatio, and get your solution and utilize it, but not at people,
Yeah.
for the good of people,
Right.
good of yourself.
And the problem is we've just elected an administration which is early adolescent, is not experienced. One of the reasons why we should not elect U.S. presidents who don't have military experience, because they haven't been tempered by war as John F. Kennedy had it. And um, it's one thing to know how to fight a war; it's another to fight the war. And what we have to understand is that um, you know nobody wants to fight a war, but somebody has to know how. And and knowing how doesn't mean that you'll do it. It means you know how. And
I would say Einstein comes to mind, where I would respectfully disagree in that you can't get out of a problem with the same thinking that got you into the problem.
right, obviously that's true, and I don't think the solution of the problem is near observable as yet.
Yeah,
Um,
we have to
and
live it.
and so we have to be conscious of it. So I agree with you entirely that what we have to be is an observer and not get involved.
But
I feel strongly that what is wrong today will correct itself in enantiodromia. I can already see that happening in our American politics. Um, but there are a lot of Americans who have to be tempered and in their behavior. And until that happens, we've got a problem. And part of the problem is that my generation, I'm the first year of the baby boom, came along and we were tempered by war one way or another, because of the Vietnam War. And um, the result was that we've been leading the United States. My generation has been leading the United States for 30 years. And that shouldn't be. Okay, that shouldn't be. Things should pass along to new generations. And so, beginning with Bill Clinton, um, let's see, we've had Clinton, we had Bush, Obama's a generation sort of at the end of the baby boom. Um, and then we had Trump, um, and then we had Biden, and now Trump again. And we haven't got past it because all those men, most of them were born within a year or two of me. And only Biden is a little bit older. He's 5 years older than I am, or 4 years older. But the others, with the exception of Obama, who was at the end of the baby boom, um, were born within a year of me in 1946, including our incoming president. And we aren't the people that should be running the show anymore.
When I think it's clear, when I say observer and you say observer, I think it's clear to each of us what we're saying. But I think to the audience too, to clarify, it does not mean inert or not acting and not being actionable. And I think I'll pull Debbie's concept of the other in. And as an observer, what I'm starting to notice is, am I acting because of an other, because of another, or something in me that is disturbing me from an other inside that
Yeah.
is just me getting irritated? And so I find it important to not basically not make as much noise as the media and chatter
Hmm.
back and forth with them, so to speak, and with small talk with things that they have said, and instead truly observe the radar in my environment for expectations. Because I think when you expect something, it creates a blind spot. And
Yeah.
interesting, utilizing Debbie's concept of the other, in the first end note of this last chapter that we read,
Hmm.
it said psychiatrists at one time were called alienists because they worked with psychic experiences alien to normal consciousness.
Yep.
The more modern and postmodern term other has had a long and varied history in psychoanalysis, as well as the arts, literature, and criticism. I use the term here not so much in the technical sense of Lacan or Bion or others, but in the simplest sense of not constructed or constituted by ego consciousness. And I think that's important because the blind spots of expectation are pretty much pattern recognition and ego consciousness, and not anything that's set in stone within you. Um, so I think that Debbie's concept of other keeps things fluid and fresh and able to see something new instead of missing it simply because you've never seen it before. And then I think it's responsive instead of reactive. And
Okay, well, let us begin. I don't want to belabor this point right now. I'm thinking about at some point, if I can't manage to keep working at school, I may start doing daily sessions, but on the events of the day, not on Jungian psychology.
I'll be
Uh,
right back.
yep. Okay. So we're going to read from an essay today by Josephine Evans Secker. And the title of it, working with, sorry, we're working with this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And um, I think a lot of people wonder what is meant by postmodern conditions. And uh, I think I struggled with it for many years, but in the end, it comes down to the fact that all of the containers for our psyche have split apart, and so the result is that we have diversity everywhere. We have a large percentage of the German population has now uh, had their origin in Turkey, for example, and other Muslim countries. The same is true in France, which was not the case before, let's say, World War II. Um, and certainly it didn't really start until Germany started to realize that they didn't have enough population to do the work of their country. And so they had to start bringing in labor from Turkey, and those people stayed and became Germans. And we have the same problem in the United States, um, where we uh, have to have 1.5 million new immigrants every year in order just to maintain the status quo because the country is growing in population. People have babies, and more people have babies, and so the result is that whereas the population of the country, maybe when I was a boy, was around 100 million, today it's 330 million, and that has lots of jobs in it, obviously, in lots of places. And so, for example, my friend Tim Holmes, who's a sculptor and relies on being able to cast his clay carvings in bronze, um, lost one of his foundries in Montana because the foundry that he used to use had 12 jobs in it, and uh, Tim and I and another friend all visited um, that foundry about 2 years ago, and at that point, the boss could only fill five of the jobs, 5 out of 12 of the jobs, and ultimately he had to go out of business because he couldn't, he didn't have enough people to cast bronze, which is a very challenging activity and requires you to be able to bring, raw metal to uh, the melting point, bronze to the melting point, and then pour it into the mold. Um, and that's impossible with 4 or 5 people. And because it takes 2 people just to hold the cauldron. and they hold it on sticks at both ends, and they have this asbestos suits that protect them from the heat, which is in the, I don't know, 2,000-degree range or something like that. It's a very hot temperature. And so not everybody wants to do that or can do it, but traditionally immigrants have done. And many of the immigrants that have come into the U.S. probably are metal workers, have been metal workers in their past. And if we only had a way to sort them, we could say, okay, you should go to Montana because there's where you can find work, but usually they don't get that information. And so they end up working the night shift on the Francis Scott Key Bridge and um, getting dunked in the water in Maryland, which is not a very good use of that talent. I'm not saying that that's true. I'm just hypothesizing that they end up doing some of the other scut work that more long-term Americans um, are not willing to do or not able to do anymore, and um, and so we're losing businesses, and this is happening all over the country. The so-called red states are starting to realize that, oh, by the way, we're losing women. Women are leaving the red states because they don't want to live in that kind of a society. And so, anyway,
Interesting when people have enough business, but then not enough people to do the business.
yeah.
So it's one of the reverse failure reasons. I mean, it's not because you couldn't get enough business. It's because you had more than you could do, or you had something to offer, and you need 12 positions to run that foundry, and when you only have 5, you're 7 short of even being able to do anything. So it's almost like kids skipping school. I mean, it's
Mhm.
like not everybody's present, and to do what you already have commissioned to do.
Yeah. And I work at a school where we help young people um, mature. We keep them safe until they do mature, and they do mature. in our school, but they come to us at a time when their behavior is uncontrollable, and so they don't fit into the normal public school um, setting, and it's our task to basically keep them safe, and to the extent we can, educate them until they gain enough maturity so that they can go back into the general population. And what I've observed about my fellow faculty members is this is the most compassionate group I've ever worked with. They are incredibly compassionate, and are willing to take um, unbelievable abuse from children who don't know any better, and and hold on until the children grow up, until these same children grow up and can go back into the general education population. And it's a very, very tough job. I mean, I've been in a classroom with one student and 7 adults, and we didn't have enough adults. That's how bad it is, or can be sometimes. And so,
It's hard to contain erupting nature, you
yeah,
know?
sure, that's what it is. That's what it amounts to.
Mhm.
And yet, all of us, what we see in our politics is basically erupting nature. And, people have gotten used to this tit for tat business, when in peace, plan for war, when in war, plan for peace. And we have to stop that kind of thinking. We have
And we
to,
could plan for abundance. And,
yeah, exactly. And so,
but
and
thing is, I laugh, abundance is not profitable. Healthy people aren't profitable. So, follow the money.
well, no,
They're
they can be profitable, but they aren't profitable in the old way of thinking.
right.
That's a fact. Okay, so Dwight Eisenhower worried about the industrial complex at the end of his term, which was back in the end of the 50s, and the military industrial complex, because it requires us um, to keep building weapons. And so, for example, just yesterday, my wife told me the United States has given $4 billion more dollars. That's 4,000 million more dollars worth of weapons to Israel. And $4 billion is a lot of money. And the
And what
100
about North
billion,
Carolina?
yeah.
The
And so
Amish have
what?
North Carolina for sure. They built like 48 tiny homes in 48 hours. I mean,
Yeah.
it was like this whole group of 50 or some Amish people just descended and started building tiny homes, and they're just cranking them out. And so
Mhm.
that's kind of I think the attitude of help and compassion.
Yeah.
Also, too, I think what's interesting is, um, people are, oh my God, it's cold and flu season. Oh my God, it's cold and flu season. No, it's too much sugar and alcohol and processed foods weakening your immune system season. It's like,
Yeah.
and everyone
Amen.
using their holidays to be sick instead of, recuperate.
Right. Okay. So, having said all that, it's been a bit of a diversion, but I let it run because of the new year. But in any case, we're reading essays
Yep.
out of this book, Jung's Red Book for Our Time, Searching for Soul Under Postmodern Conditions. And certainly Jung himself, at the time that he was writing the Red Book, did not know a lot of these things. He worked them out over the career that followed the Red Book. Um, and I think that what he did by leaving us the Red Book, which he didn't consciously publish, he wasn't sure when it would be appropriate to publish. He said who would understand it. Um, he didn't consciously publish it, and it was only Sonu Shamdasani and a few other visionaries who got together and pulled it together. Mainly Sonu Shamdasani did it. Um, and it took him 13 years from the time he actually started to do it until they published the Red Book. And then Shamdasani has spent another 10 years translating and publishing the Black Books, which are Jung's basic clinical notes for this period. And what we do is try to contextualize what was happening to Jung with what happens to everybody's psyche now, okay? Because while I don't claim to understand the Red Book completely, I at least follow it and have had experiences with it such that I believe the experience can now be contained. It's like there was a thermonuclear explosion in Jung's head in this 10-week period. Most of the Red Book, 80% of the Red Book, took place in 10 weeks between Christmas Day 1913 and the middle of March 1914. Almost all of it is written in that 10-week period.
Yeah.
And all the Black Books were written in that period. And Jung himself spent 15 years, which is what the Red Book is Jung then took that experience, which was in his clinical notes, and started to interpret it for the rest of us in different ways. First, by recording it in a incredible, basically a scrapbook. We could think of the Red Book as a scrapbook of Jung's own experiences. And Jung advised that we all create our own Red Book so that we can go back and look and see where we've come from. And so, even though unbeknownst to me, I've been doing that most of my life, and certainly in the last 30 years I have. So, some of you are familiar with my recent artwork, but this piece right here over my shoulder was a painting that I did about 20 years ago, maybe more than 20 years ago. And obviously it's not an abstract piece. It's actually the view from our beach here out in front of my house, across the Severn River. But I now want to sort of contextualize all these things that have been happening to me for the last 35 years since I started to study Jung. And so I will begin.
Well,
Joseph,
I think you
go ahead.
clarified. I think just really quickly, I think I just kind of came to mind our little op-ed diversion that we had for the new year to start out with current events and such is, I think, directly actually rather than diversion. It's we were speaking to see the other, see the other outside and the other inside, which is very Jungian in regards to observe what is occurring and don't hide from the intensities, harness the intensities, even record the intensities, and really, really, I think, dial into who you are. And I think that's what we were talking about, that in the world, and then historically, and then the other of what is the new way is the question. And this inner outer other, I think, is part of that.
Right. And Jung's comment, who would understand it? Obviously, no one in his time understood it, or very few people. and really throughout his life and right up to his time of his death, there was a very, very small cadre of people, maybe 25, but a handful, um, in the context of what we have now with internet and so on, who had any clue what he was up to. Um, and and so it took Shamdasani to say, now wait a minute, okay, in the 1990s now, 30 years after or 40 years after Jung's death, because it came out 48 years after his death, the Red Book. Um, Shamdasani says, no, wait a minute, now there are enough people in the world who can get their minds around it.
Mm-hmm.
And it isn't, uh, it's even for the Jungian analysts themselves, um, had a hard time. Even Murray Stein had a hard time getting his mind around it. And it was only upon the insistence of Thomas Arst that the Red Book for Our Time started to be put together. And Thomas Arst had a lunch with Murray and convinced him that somebody should write these books. And originally, the idea was they would do one and have, Murray Stein said, who would write about the Red Book? How much can you say about the Red Book?
Mm-hmm.
And he even says so on video in 2016. There's a video of Murray Stein talking this way and saying who would understand it. And it was Thomas Arst, my friend, who unfortunately was one of the first casualties of COVID. But Thomas insisted that there was much more depth to what Jung was saying than anybody really comprehended. And surely it won't all be unpacked for centuries more, probably, but in a comprehensible way, because there's no explanation out there. There's no clear explanation of what Dr. Jung was driving at. And so each of us comes at it like coming at a crystal ball, and we have our own perception. And so now, after 5 volumes of this book, we see now 70 mostly made Jungian analysts who are looking at it from different perspectives. And now Jordan and I, as laymen, are coming back and saying, oh, well, there's more to it than that, because we come at it from a secular point of view, not from a analyst point of view. We're
But I
not.
think that's
Go ahead.
important right there. I think because we're secular with a similar expertise. Now, don't have the intensities of the highs and the lows. I haven't dealt with, caged schizophrenics, but I deal with lots of homeless people.
Mm-hmm.
And there's a similarity in a lot of them. And
Surely.
as shop owners, we actually all take care of them. We know them by name.
Yeah.
So in a sense, it's the outpatients, as it were. But I'm not going to say I have the expertise of an analyst, but at the same time, I think these 5 volumes with these made Jungian analysts, they're pulling back the veil to demystify the inner world without losing the mystery, so that what happens is we can energize the experiential instead of the Greek rational reason knowing, logos stuff that has no arrows in it, and look beyond that dualism to each of our individual experiences and how these articles can elucidate us. And it reminds me of ancient Egypt and the book by the psychologist Julian Jaynes, which was the origin of consciousness and the breakdown of the bicameral mind.
Mm-hmm.
And to simplify that, the bicameral mind was polytheistic. the ideas in your head were seen as outside voices. They
Well,
were
and there and still probably 95% of all human beings um, think that there is a being, a single being called God.
mhm,
And
instead
uh,
of it being the whole universe.
instead of it being everything, instead of um, this is the universe that we've been given, and if it changed, like I think it's like 0.3% or something like that, uh, everything would have been blown up, millions of years, billions of years ago, probably.
Hmm.
And so the rules that exist in our universe, the physics rules, can't be changed. They're um, absolutely set in stone, so to say. and and we have to live within the context of what we've been given. But going back beyond the Big Bang, what did happen more than 13.7 billion years ago? What did happen there? That wasn't the beginning of time. There was something else. Uh, and so,
The milestone
um,
moment of the from based on the previous. I mean, the nothingness is kind of a nebulous, almost nefarious concept because
right.
what if you go back to the origin? Well, then nothing was there. What would happen? Nothing.
Yeah.
So I mean, something. So there's a whole. I love the existential aspect of the something and the nothing, and the nothing is something, and no, it's not. It's nothing.
Yeah.
It's
Yeah. So Sri says, for all the critical analysis, philosophy has not managed to root out its psychopaths. Carl Jung philosophy still has to learn that it is made by human beings and depends on an alarming degree an alarming degree on their psychic constitution. Absolutely, I agree entirely.
yeah.
And
I like
and
that. Their psychic constitution. That's a really good phrase.
Right. And so when Jordan and I have these conversations on a weekly basis, um, we're not giving you a final answer. Okay. We're giving you our perception at this point of time in the 21st century. And
Kind of an idea buffet.
right. And so you then have to go back and chew on them. You, the viewer, has to go back and chew on them and come back with your own ideas. And if enough people on the earth do that, then we can have peace on earth. Simple as that. Um, and so anyway, reading on. Incandescent matter, this incandescent matter, Shudder, Shimmer, Stammer, Solitude by Joseph Evans Secker. This paper attempts to be as attentive as it can be to Jung's language, to explore its impact as a way of feeling into the integrity of the content, to let it register, for this will affect my reception of the images as well as the argument. Such attunement to text establishes essential reader-author trust. Liber Novus, which is what many people call the Red Book, but I do not. Um, Liber Novus, claimed by Jung to be the nucleus of his later work, was known to informed Jungians only through a few tantalizing glimpses until it was made available to the public in 2009. With little knowledge of its existence and no knowledge of the imminent publication in the September of that same year, I dreamed, quote, we are in an upstairs room above a big ancient church. On a large lectern, there is a very large book lying open. I assume it must be a Bible, but it was more like the Duc de Berry's Grand Heure, Great Hours. As we gather around it and I go toward the lectern, the volume bursts into flames. The dream words were, "It self-immolates." I am stunned and amazed. The next night, quote, I have a sense of moving through huge buildings. On ground floors, I come to the end to reach a door. I open it and stand looking out on a vast landscape. I have a sense of reaching the end of something and experiencing wholly new vistas. Unquote. Okay, so at this point, Jordan, could you hold up my Christmas gift to you? Um, this painting by me is my sort of summation of Jungian psychology as it is in a debate between Jung and uh, Sigmund Freud. And it's entitled Tracks to Nowhere Through Magnificence. And the point is that you can take it down, Jordan.
Funny, I took it out and then I put it back in to keep it protected until I frame it. And I just now noticed. I went, I missed that part. And there's the pale blue dot in the back.
Right. Okay. So on the back of this painting, which I gave to many of my friends and colleagues this Christmas time, I included an image of the pale blue dot. And the reason is because I consider both images to be sort of a sum and substance of not only Jung, but of the debate between Jung and Freud, and the debate of all of us, because the tracks to nowhere are basically all the works of all living creatures since the beginning of time. They all occurred on the pale blue dot. And the magnificence is the entire universe itself. You can't comprehend it.
Well, it's interesting. You can't comprehend it. And my whole, your blind spots of expectation. I saw this, but I always put a backing in these so that this doesn't touch the back and it protects the back. So when I took it out, I kept it together. So when I put it back in, it would go back together. And then, okay, so snake in the grass, I got bit, and didn't even see that right in front of me. But what's interesting is then the pale blue dot and your note, it's upside down. So it's not lost in me that's you're seeing across an axis rather it being, it's not an error.
So read what I said. I don't remember what I said on yours.
Dear Jordan, Merry Christmas. This is for gluing on the back of the enclosed print. I hope you enjoy it. Taken July 19th, 2013 from the Cassini spacecraft. Best regards, Skip. Here. And then if I flip it, you are here. Yeah. And, it says you are here. And the pale blue dot is right in there. I mean, it's hard to see on this print. There you go.
Yep, there it is. It's visible.
That text is that way, and then your text is this way. And so what's interesting is no matter how you turn the earth, you're still there. I mean, and so I think that's kind of, I like the humor in that, because you get the opposites and the other.
Right. And of course, Freud thought everything was rational and that everything could be reduced to some rational argument. And that's the point of the tracks to nowhere, which is regardless of what we have done, from creating this pen to anything else that we've done, written, etc., it's restricted to its own orbit. And so I think of it as a I think of a little railroad train going across a desert, and the train is on tracks, and we are limited to the tracks that have been left behind by all other species since the beginning of time. But we're missing the magnificence that within which we live.
But if I use the phrase psychic constitution, which came up, I am gonna steal that because that's really good. Because rather than disparaging Freud, I can say that his psychological or his psychic constitution was very prude to have a reason for everything, because that's kind of childish show pony and restrictive and incarcerating. It's a lot more alive and other, and to work the not knowing and the disappearing path while not knowing and still getting things done, but not having to explain and prove everything.
Yeah.
So I love that psychic constitution, because then I can just make an observation about Freud, but then it's not disparaging. It's just my opinion. And then it doesn't even need to stick. So I think the psychic constitution of the Red Book was Jung knew no one else would get it, but that didn't stop him from doing it. And it reminds me of Georgia O'Keeffe when she was asked why she painted her flowers so big. And she said, everybody looks. I want them to see. So I think when you dial into just the mandala at your feet, and gravel or a garden or flowers,
Sure.
This is the general mandala that's nature itself. I think that enhances the psychic constitution. It gives us good fuel.
Yeah. Let me just read the background first of this author, Josephine Ebbett Secker. Master of Philosophy, graduated from University of London 1963 and 1966, and the C.G. Jung Institute, Zurich, 1989. She taught at the University of Calgary, Department of English, and retired with emeritus status to return to England in 1997. She is currently co-chair of AGAP Zurich, and is active in the London Training Group, IGAP. She lectures for ISAP Zurich, which is the International Society of Analytical Psychology, Zurich, and IGAP, and London's Guild of Pastoral Psychology, and Jung Club, as well as in the U.S.A. She was a founding source of the Calgary Jung Society, where she still lectures. She has edited volumes of fairy tales and published various articles on literature and psychology and poetry. Major publications: Tales of Mothers and Sons, 1998, Tales of Fathers and Sons, 1998, Tales of Fathers and Daughters, 1997, Tales of Mothers and Daughters, 1996. In conjunction with Spring Journal Books, she gave the 2011 Zurich Jung Lectures, accompanying the book, At Home in the Language of the Soul, Exploring Jungian Discourse and Psyche's Grammar of Transformation, 2012. She is also an active retired Anglican priest in the Mulgrave parishes near York. She has Jungian practice in Whitby, Yorkshire. And then it gives her contact email, which you can get if you get this book. All right, so that's her background. And so having said everything we said about Tracks to Nowhere, I want to read again. Now, this was this is what she said before she knew that Jung's Red Book would be published. And so, with little knowledge of its existence and no knowledge of its imminent publication, in the September of that same year, 2009, I dreamed, quote, "We are in an upstairs room above a big ancient church. On a large lectern, there is a very large book lying open. I assume it must be a Bible, but it was more like the Duc de Berry's Grande Heure. Um, as we gather around it and I go toward the lectern, the volume bursts into flames. The dream words were, 'It self-immolates.' And I am stunned and amazed. The next night, quote, I have a sense of moving through huge buildings on ground floors. I come to the end and I reach a door. I open it and stand looking out on a vast landscape. I have a sense of reaching the end of something and experiencing wholly new vistas," yeah, unquote. Okay, so that's why I wanted to emphasize the tracks to nowhere.
Well, and I think it's key there. It self-immolates, which is it self-sacrifices, and
Right.
that's living. That's the dying and the living and the living and the dying. All that kind of brings us around to, you started with funerals, at scale, but
Mhm.
then the self-immolation is self-sacrifice, which, I mean, sacrifice your time for what you want, or you'll sacrifice what you want because you don't spend the time. And I think that it self-immolates. The book is alive.
Right. And of course, we know um, that all species will end by immolation by our own sun about 1 billion years from now. Um, and and so this discussion reminds me of the Robert Frost poem Fire and Ice, in which he let's see, I think we can probably get it on the screen so we can read it, uh, because it is relevant here. Okay, Fire and Ice by Robert Frost. And it's copyright 1923 by Robert Frost. Some say the world will end in fire, some say in ice. From what I've tasted of desire, I hold with those who favor fire. But if it had to perish twice, I think I know enough of hate to say that for destruction, ice is also great and would suffice. Okay.
Well, it's interesting. Even the last word is kind of punny. The suff ice. It's like suffering
Yeah.
ice.
Yeah.
That it will do.
Okay. All right. So let's see what this Secker has to say. The room I recognize is the library of a London church where we held choir practices and where I first sang polyphonic music. In the following spring, 1910 or 2010, when I first saw Jung's newly published tome, it felt familiar. A strange synchronistic introduction to the beautiful and riddlesome totality that was that was to challenge me. The residual energy of those dreams helped shape my response to Jung's major opus. Ulrich Herney, rightly, and this is a grandson of Carl Jung, Ulrich Herney rightly assumed that competent interpretations will be given in forthcoming secondary literature. Papers in this volume attest to that, but this is not an interpretive paper. My aim is to simply to record personal responses to Jung's incandescent matter. This incandescence shook and still stirs me. Written in volatile times of cultural crisis, Jung's goal was to evolve a new worldview and God image in the throes of such crisis. Whereas Nietzsche preached the death of God, Jung yearned for God to be reconceived, renewed, reimagined. He wanted to go on living with a new God. His imagination labors at this task. His ignited mind, for this is also my task. As we might know, because she's an Anglican priest. As always, in the background to my response to Psyche lies Adam Phillips's dictum that we should not make psychoanalytic work into a science of the sensible passions, as though the aim of psychoanalysis was to make people more intelligible to themselves rather than to realize how strange they are. The uncanny strangeness of his own interior world, Jung reveals throughout this monumental work that he chose not to publish in his lifetime. Uncanny is Jung's word as well as Freud's. In the literature, Herney predicted would follow publication, the Red Book has provoked intense reactions. It is a poetic meditation, a daunting hermeneutic challenge, a work of conscience, a gnosis for modernity, a monstrosity magnificent and grotesque, existential and postmodern. Though experienced as alarmingly impressive, few have so far agreed with Gingrich that the Red Book fails being absolutely esoteric. Such diverse responses might remind us of a truth articulated in relation to Dostoevsky's Underground Man that, quote, it is the fate of all great texts to be both mutable and many faceted, enough that every generation of readers can seek their own image within them, unquote. As an undergraduate, I was set an essay topic about a poet I liked, instructed to justify the objection that his poetry rings no bells, being linguistically and contextually local and idiosyncratic, ignoring the tradition. I considered this fallible as chief criterion of value. Ringing elusive bells, there might be richly fueled by personal complexes in the service of art. With this critical approach still hovering, decades later I entered Jung's epic search for his way of what is to come. Page by page, I experienced a veritable elusive tinnitus, tinnitus. I call it tinnitus, but yeah,
By ear ringing. It's the ear ringing.
yeah, ear ringing in the ears. Standard critical language proves inadequate to describe the density of reference. Jung goes so far beyond typical forms of intercultural, intertextual echo. It, if Hermes is the god of the preposition between, his foot and fingerprints are everywhere, pointing in every conceivable direction, sometimes simultaneously. As Paul Bishop says, he goes far beyond mere elusiveness. Nevertheless, these resonances are peculiarly satisfying, embedding us culturally while pushing us beyond creedal comfort.
It's
No
interesting.
kidding.
The creed and creed.
Okay, I'm going to
comfort.
take a short bio break. I'll be right back. Go ahead, Jordan.
Well, the beyond creedal comfort, so beyond the comfort of creeds, and then ignoring the tradition in capitals. It just reminds me when I say tradition is just peer pressure from dead people. Compost it to nourish the soil, but it doesn't get a vote. I mean, we have to, move forward our way. But at the same time, the whole modern, postmodern, you don't have to reinvent the wheel. So, but I think what's interesting is understanding this point where should not make psychoanalytical work into a science of the sensible passions. I mean, who's going to say what's sensible? That's up to you, me, anyone else. But the aim was to make people more intelligible to themselves. So that's self-understanding. And I think what's interesting, especially with Jung, is that self-understanding, contrasting Freud with Jung, it's the Jungian piece is it's more experiential. I mean, it doesn't have to be rational, just like intuitions, the reasons are all unreasonable. Things just appear, like the volcano erupted. Well, it came out of the earth. Why? Well, there's a whole background, but I think the volcano is a nice image of intuition and the self-understanding and looking at how does nature self-understand. Well, it lives and thrives and dies. And I think the thrival piece there is very Jungian to, understand not a ringing in the ears of that which has come before, but how do you resonate? What sounds, what experiences come to you or are already in your life that are beyond creedal comfort, beyond the comfort of creeds. So I think the concept of reasons are unreasonable, that concept of capital O other, and antiodromia, the tendency to things to go their opposite. But even the self-immolation, not like monks and cat o' nine tails slapping their back with taking the pain. Sacrifice is one of the first things towards making something sacred. And I think, for example, if you have an altar or have a special place in your house, what are those things that even you sacrifice from your experience? Like maybe I have rocks in my pocket, but sometimes I'm going to sacrifice them being with me to put them in a special place. And in a sense, that's making talismans, making magic of things that stay and I feel at least enliven my home when I'm even away. So I think this creedal comfort is, the comfort with creeds. I think it's important to find our own and not the, creeds of others and, agree or disagree with others. And, it really doesn't matter. It's, I think, the ability to have the dignity in difference and the difference of you as another. And I sacrifice my need to control or understand. And I think that self-sacrifice piece, the self-immolation, not being a sadist thing, the sacrifice is the first step towards making something sacred. So, and you're back.
Right. So what was the sacrifice to making something sacred?
That, with the self-immolation here, that it's not the monk's cat of nine tails being sadist and, imparting pain to yourself. The sacrifice is one of the first steps towards making something sacred. For example, a simple, mundane example, if I find some pretty rocks that I keep in my pocket, and then one day I decide, it's not a Linus blanket. I'm going to take it out of my pocket and put it at a special place in my house and not have it with me all the time. I sacrifice it from my personal experience in the sense to enliven my home when I'm away. And I think that letting go, having the disappearing path, as Debbie has aptly lectured on or presented, being comfortable with the not knowing, sacrificing the need for a reason to have instead the experience and be able to just steep like tea in the experience and continue living it instead of always hitting speed bumps and stopping and pausing and having to explain away. And if you see dancers, they don't tell you why they're going to do the next step. You look for the resonant flow, how fluid they move. And I think so dance and music, I think dance and music are probably two of the purest forms of divination because you're moved by it or you're moved away from it. I mean, there's a black and white of. I mean, with music, it's and I'll turn it off or move it, or wow, this really gets me moving, and I'm literally moved. So I think back to the self-sacrifice. Sacrifice is the first step towards making something sacred. And
Yeah,
so the things you dutifully sacrifice in life, and it doesn't mean punishment. It means, say, I sacrifice this much of my time to do tarot sessions because it gives me joy to see
yeah,
someone else resonate with themselves more. And and it's not my stuff. It's them and me, helping them tune themselves rather than me explaining anything to them.
right. Yeah, the other piece that I used as a Christmas gift this year was one of my um, Rocky pieces, and the point I made on that, I put something on the backside of that as well, and I said, what I've realized by doing these over the last year is that they represent my unconscious. And when the viewer looks at it, they do not see my unconscious. They see their own. They see their own unconscious. And because you couldn't possibly know what I was thinking, what came to mind as I was doing any particular line or splotch of color. But um, what you do see is what it means to you. Um, and and so that convinces me about abstract art because for many
Mm-hmm.
years, for decades, I, like a lot of people, didn't think abstract art amounted to anything, but now I understand its purpose is to let each of us see our own unconscious. And
I think
and
that's a really good point in terms of even the ignoring the tradition, because you go so far into tradition, it's like being pulled in a glider behind a plane to get
yeah,
airborne. But then when you finally ignore the tradition, you cut the cable or release the cable,
yeah,
and then you get the literally the flight of the higher mind in the embracing and engaging of your own unconscious. And in a sense, then you are sacrificing all the history to live yourself into and in the now, or eternal moment, as Jung says, or I always call it the perpetual present, and where it's the confluence of memories and dreams, or past and future.
yeah. And I have not yet exposed this to anybody, but a year ago, on or about January 19th, 2024, I had a vision, and it's what I call Vision of America. And all of my work since then um, has been studies for Vision of America. So many of you may know that the Grinch is study number 5 um, of Vision. It's Vision of America study number 5, which I tongue in cheek call the Grinch. And study number 8 is the Magician, for example. And And so since that time, I've been working on something I also call Vision of America number 1, which is it's 40 inches wide and 25 and a half inches deep. Um, so it's something like 1,080 square inches, the original of this painting. And I've been working on it for the entire year, literally, in fits and starts. I haven't been able to work on it during school days because it's too cumbersome to get out. to work on it, but I do work on it on weekends, and finally it's getting to the point where I have hopes, and we'll see how my hopes work out of completing it in the next couple of weeks, and therefore completing it within a year. One painting that I've finished in a year. Go ahead, Jordan.
It's interesting you brought up the magician piece, and you're basically you're making the unconscious query into the universe of looking at what's going on. In the next paragraph, I was like, oh, this is a new word. It's like nekia, Nekyia. What's another word for oracle?
Mm-hmm.
It's in ancient Greek cult practice and literature. Anekia or nekya is a rite by which ghosts were called up and questioned about the future.
Yeah.
And ghosts would then be there metaphorically. Your unconscious can be that ghost or ghosts.
Right. And I actually gave smaller size prints of the magician to four favored people. Three of them are administrators at my school, and one is the art teacher at my school who got number one. And what I said to them, because it shows a person in a Swami-like turban looking toward the right of the image. And so I said, the magician is the person who looks into the future and sees its possibilities and changes the future, can change the future because of the point at the intersection between the past and the future. The magician can actually change the future. And what I meant by that is that an educator can change the future of a child simply by performing their magic.
I think that's a wonderful way to put it, because what comes to mind at big scale is the Big Bang. And what's happening is, to me, the magician is the arche of architecture, which is the inception, the first spark. And so when you get that first spark, that is the Big Bang in the rest of their life, you have magically altered the course of their future because you've put them now in charge of commanding their future. And I think what's interesting is that whole part of teaching and learning to help clarify their vision of how and what they can see, instead of being limited, by these core limiting beliefs of all of their friends have gone to here, prison, or there, what have you, that they don't have to go where they allegedly are headed, and they can alter their course because you made the Big Bang in their mind, which was that magician's first step, the wand. And the wand pointed towards the ground, where the nature is really the magic that comes out of the other wand and intuition.
Yeah.
So the nature erupting, that you're making big bangs in young people's minds that basically originate a potentially abundant life their way moving forward, and crack them out of the incarcerating environment that they expect, so they can ignore the tradition and get into nature of their own nature.
Absolutely. So Cherie says people would not have been reading for Carl Jung in his time. The time of his works came exactly at the right time in history. Jung understood this. Isn't this why it was kept a secret? Surely. The family left with his works, allowed those with the correct knowledge of works, and brought it forth. It had been locked away. And Richard says, Catholic belief is we must empty ourselves of all we can to make room for God. Okay, fair enough. And then
Actually,
Sri
to
goes,
speak to that comment directly before you go,
okay, go ahead.
that to me reminds me of the full story of Pandora's box, where, I mean, any woman worth demonizing is probably worth getting to know a lot better. But
Right.
if the best way, I think, to learn mythology and history is to look for where have they demonized a woman, but find the original. Because in Pandora's box, you know, she's demonized for releasing all the ills and malaise and blackness and plague into the world. Well, the translation is not box. Properly translated, it's vessel, which equals her. And after all that, they truncate the story. They cut it off, you know, right when they can blame her. But what happens next is after she's emptied all of that out of her, which is all the Negretto, what does she do next? She peers into her vessel. Well, she peers into herself. And at the very bottom of the vessel, in the darkest place, she sees a golden, pure fledgling of eternal hope. And she takes that and she picks it up out of the depths and she puts it in her heart. So there's, you know, the goal is to empty yourself and to then put the eternal hope, the universe, golden fledgling, God, true trust, love into your heart. So sorry to just jump in and cut off, but that comment from Richard,
Great observation. Yeah.
seemed really loaded.
Right. So Cherie goes on. The basilisk is a kind of lizard found in Mexico and Central South America. They are harmless, climbing and swimming with great activity. The fabulous basilisk was by the ancients believed to be Pandora, is Eve.
Oh, so yeah, we were right there together. How funny.
Right.
Nice.
Right.
Well,
And so, I mean, isn't that awfully true in terms of, if we take it in terms of the women of Europe? Jung wrote an essay called Women in Europe in 1929, which was exactly pretty much halfway between World War I and World War II.
mm-hmm.
And
Almost a century ago.
Pardon? And
Almost
almost a century ago, yes. And so the women magically created the future, in effect. Okay, a lot of babies had to be born shortly after World War I in order for there to be enough young people to fight World War II.
Well, you know, and to extend Richard and Cherie's and then my Pandora piece, there's such a synchronicity when then Cherie goes to the Eve character from Pandora. What's interesting is if I drop back a step to Lilith, who was the moon was Lilith's first husband in folklore. Adam was second. Well, she utters the ineffable name of God, which gets her kicked out of Eden, but she's savvy enough, like Pallas Athena or Minerva, to tell this unconscious God, the kind of answer to Job God, I can obey you faster if you give me wings. And so she gets wings and she flies away over the hill. I don't think she went out and made, you know, legions of demons. I think she turned into the serpent, slithered back into the garden, inhabited the tree of knowledge, and seduced Eve to bite the apple. And so, in a sense, then her uttering the name of God, her uttering divinity, was conceiving consciousness because she made the first choice. And then she hands it off to the younger high priestess, basically, of Eve, who then, by biting the apple, actionably births consciousness. So, you know, I've made that whole sequence up from, you know, cobbling together multiple folklore pieces and then my own, I'll just embellish this here. But what I find in then the women of Germany between the wars who repopulate, rebuild the country, they're generative. So that ability to give life, in a sense, is that convention of the Nekia, you know, calling up the ghosts for the future. Well, they're birthing the children for the future from out of nothingness. So there's a whole lot in there. I think that, um, again, if I see a woman demonized somewhere, I stop in my tracks and I'll just open up to find, oh, I'm going to have a new shiro, most likely, as I
Yeah.
call them, instead of heroes, or the shiros, because they're the ones who are going to really generate a lot of, generate a lot of the calling up the ghosts, the ability to work with my unconscious naturally.
Yeah.
Where with dudes, we're going to compete and play catch as catch can and get lost there. So
yeah, what came across my mind as you were talking, and this is completely non sequitur, but um, I pretty much have decided to give to my grandchildren um, all access to my diary and all of my writings and all of the videos that I've participated in and everything for the last, I don't know, 30 years. Um, post my bit Marine Corps time, but before my business career really got going. Um, and they can do anything they want to it with it, uh, and and that's really amounts to my red book. Okay, so I've kept my correspondence and at least my side of my correspondence because I've said a few things over the years.
yeah, right.
and but as I was listening to you, I thought, what I really ought to do is just make all this material available to anybody who wants to go back and look at it, because there are a lot of interesting things there. Not all of them I'm proud of, but um, there are a lot of good things that people could make something of, which
Mm-hmm.
you can't necessarily do in a lifetime, in your own lifetime. Okay, so let me go on here. The central organizing convention of the Nicaea is already well documented. So many reverberating tales of underworld descending, Orpheus, Odysseus, Inanna, and so on. In our daily praxis, we encounter such personal, perhaps humbler catabasis in dreams. Typically, there are guides, Anubis and Charon, even dogs and dolphins, angel escorts of various kinds. Clearly familiar with Dante's Virgil, Jung evolved Philemon from archaic sources. He was already a familiar soul companion. Many Jungian writers have amplified this. For me, numberless bells rang. Anglophone readers might also feel from time to time the energy of Bunyan's evangelist leading his dreaming pilgrim in the celestial city. On arrival, the pilgrim saw that there was a way to hell, even from the gates of heaven, as well as from the city of destruction. Pilgrim sets out on his fantasy progress. As I walked through the wilderness of this world, I lighted on a certain place where was a den, and I laid me down in that place to sleep. And as I slept, I dreamed a dream. I dreamed, and behold, I saw a man clothed in rags. This colored my setting out into Jung's eerie wasteland. Bunyan's ragged, wretched wretch seeks the very salvation that Jung is compelled to challenge. A reader such as I am, exposed to an English literature probably unknown to Jung, might also recognize figures like Alice's soul guide, her white rabbit, seducing her underground. Like Christian, Alice also finally woke from her dream's underworld. A recent innovative verse novel offers Sigmund Freud himself as psychopath for it. Um, psychopomp, Freud as psychopomp for 21st century man in all too current predicament, ringing the changes in Dante's Dark Forest. Quote, when I was about halfway through life, always a cheery moment, I lost my wife to another man, and as is the natural way when a woman leaves her man of yesterday, she kept our child. So at a stroke, I found I was a lonely single bloke. Losing family and home, he takes his son on holiday to some engineered amusement park, not Dante's great forest. The theme park entrance is a lofty gate festooned with flags and made to imitate a crude portal of rusticated stone, although it's actually made with blown concrete. Above the massive lintel rise three words in silhouette against the skies: live the dream, unquote. They enter a fake world of animatronic figures, holograms, waxworks, every kind of simulation and tableau, astroturf, turf, plastic headstones, neon moons. Freud invites him to walk with me and shows him artificially contrived mythological haunts such as Xerxes Island, Homo Denarius, as is advertised at every turn. It is a wittily serious, troublingly funny, whimsically satirical narrative of what the author calls Imagineering. This illuminates compellingly the integrity of Jung's imagining beside this Disneyfied underworld, such as we might fear we inhabit. The fake world of Trump, where sensible categories of truth and authenticity break down. How prefabricated the spirit of the times, the distinction between authentic uh, imagination and artificial imagineering is helpfully provocative. Jung's driving need was to validate inner experience, announcing in his opening of the way of what is to come. If I speak in the spirit of this time, I must say no one and nothing can justify what I must proclaim to you. Justification is superfluous to me, since I have no choice, but I must. John Milton's sense of his solemn task uh, came to mind. Leaving sublime heights and depths, the poet approaches earth again, changing key to introduce his epic of the human fall. Quote, no more of talk where God or angel guest with man, as with friend familiar used to sit indulgent, and with him partake. Rural repast I now must change, those notes so tragic what in me is dark. Illumine what is low, raise and support, that in the height of this great argument, I might assert eternal providence and justify the ways of God to men, unquote. Jung's own solemn tone and mission sometimes sounds like this, and one might also hear it in Nietzsche, speaking of his grandiose task to prepare a moment of supreme meaning coming to oneself on the part of mankind. Paul Bishop notes the omnipresence of Nietzsche in Jung's experience and writing. In so many passages, not only in conjuring up Zarathustra, but implicit everywhere, this background presence throughout is what might be experienced as Jung's own personal ecce homo. Occasionally, the lingering shadow of Dostoevsky's underground man, book Jung must have known tempers Jung's apologia. The Russian's vivid self-abnegation is compensated by grandiosity. Like that of Nietzsche, it throws Jung's psychological self-assessments into relief. Their almost messianic grandiosity was clearly understood by Jung. It would be tedious to pursue such wide-ranging elusiveness further. What is striking is that no doubt in each culture or language context in which the Red Book is read, allusions specific to the culture will erupt, coloring and intensifying individual experience. All might be tracked archetypally. Related to these global undercurrents, we might consider the experimental mixing of styles and genres, technical innovations compelled by other contemporary explorations of inner reality in the wake of the discovery of the unconscious, even outside strictly psychoanalytical work. Kierkegaard developed his dialectical lyric under the same pressure of fear and trembling. Hillman speaks of the Red Book in terms of psychodramatics rather than psychodynamics. Mixing of styles, mixing of genre, mixing of categories, constantly ringing the changes, picaresque autobiography, poetic memoir, allegory, poetic prose, and pure lyric poetry, autobiography, soliloquy, Ignatian examination of conscious, confession, classical dialogue between soul and body, explicit passages of philosophical, theological, and psychological exegesis, dithyrambic energies recalling Nietzsche. Okay, I'm going to stop there for a minute. Are you still there, Jordan?
Yeah, she's, I mean, soon she's going to say that, strict classicists would deplore this, but that 20th century artists have gone beyond this. So I think the comment about Hillman being, psychodrama instead of psychodynamism, drama includes tradition. It's choreographed. It has a previous inception, whereas dynamism is life occurring now. And I think there's a distinction. She's, in a sense, she's dissecting, kind of doing a Gray's Anatomy of all the parts of history that have led up to right then. And but it's interesting, the psychodramatics rather than psychodynamics. And so psychodramatics, I mean, you can watch your reruns. What have you done in the past? What is driving you now? Whereas psychodynamics means, what kind of fuel do I have in the tank now, driving now myself?
Yeah. Right. Okay, I'm going to stop there because this essay has another 10 pages to go.
Yeah.
And so we can talk about it more next week, but I want to read the last paragraph of the whole essay as sort of a precursor to what will come, what has come, and what will come in the coming week. Last two paragraphs. My time spent wandering with Jung in these eerie ways that prepare us for what that is to come leaves me pondering what it is to be serious about the search for one's soul in the interacting fields of psychology, theology, art, and poetry. In all these realms, I now recognize not rigid atheism, but a valuable hermeneutic suspicion at the disposal of psyche. I end with such a feeling, such a drive, confessed by one poet, finding himself in sacred places. Quote, "It pleases me to stand in silence here, a serious house on serious earth, where he surprises, quote, a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground," unquote. After the compelling but searing intensities and hyperboles of Jung's inner incandescence, I resonate with a new valuing, a refrating of the adjective serious. Such a mood often prevails at the end for Jung, who returns to a humbler self, a giddy, pure, pitiful figure, who makes a solemn declaration, quote, "I decided to do what was required of me," unquote. This touches a sensitive chord in the contemporary psyche, in estranged souls of those who also want to go on living with a new God. So I guess the question ultimately becomes, what are you called to do as an individual? Okay.
Yeah,
And this isn't to Jordan, who knows this, but to my viewers, our viewers, that what are you called to do? And whatever that may be, you need to do it. And in order to maintain your own psychology. And this is also exactly the message of, wait for it, Jordan. What is the message of?
what am I in service to?
Yeah, which is the message of the Bhagavad Gita.
Yeah,
Precisely. Okay, precisely the message of the
Bhagavad
Bhagavad
Gita. It
Gita.
is, and it's a classic example to me. Also, what you're in service to doesn't have to make any sense when you first realize it,
Yeah.
and that may not make sense to people because your dad would talk you out of that. That makes no sense. That's not reasonable. Well, that's the exact person you need to pull out of the equation because, for example, like midlife at 42, you're in a Neptune square. So this nebulous expansiveness sees itself for the first time. You can turn back and go, oh, my world's bigger. Well, I'm going to tectonically shake it up because I'm on a Uranus opposition. But at 42, on a Friday afternoon, I'm doing actually Friday morning, file administration, accounting, so I can do invoicing and then go into my weekend. Well, something was terribly out of whack with my Excel spreadsheet. I thought it must be broken. So I zoom out to see the whole thing and double click on the equal at the end. Everything lit up across 52 weeks, but my eyebrows went up because my tarot sessions 3 years after I had published my deck had kept my architectural firm's doors open for 6 months, 2 quarters. And I went, oh my, what's the real job now? Well, I was so natural at tarot that I didn't find a whole lot of value in it as a job. I couldn't do that. And so what's interesting is, snake ass bit, what was right there in my direct view all the time. And so what happened is 35 years of architecture had 30 years of architecture had been my foundation for me.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened at that point, Jung was 42 when this went down. And we all have that point around that time naturally. But so I decided, don't say anything. I went out to the garden, stared at a flower for a while, and decided to be silent all weekend and just be in that. Because what am I going to run off with the circus? Be a tarot reader, tarot professional? I mean, that makes no sense. But I felt myself fighting myself.
Yeah.
And I realized, no, that's my dad talking. So that's their tradition, and not actually my actual dad. It was me who had patterned along those lines, saying that that's what he would say, which honestly was presumptuous. He might say, well, you found what you need to do. He might have been wise that way. So be careful of your limiting belief, of the presumption of what someone else is telling you to do inside. So I go through the weekend silent. And on Monday morning, as I'm walking into my office, I stop and I look down at my shoes. And it wasn't lost on me that I'm going into work.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to waste time. Why am I wasting time staring at my shoes? Because I put them on. Go figure. I tied them myself. That's a past issue. I don't need to look at them.
Right.
I'm like, wow, I'm starting my day by wasting time. But it wasn't lost on me that I was wasting time. So what's the message? And I took my shoes off. I just backed out of them and stepped back into my office right on the carpet in my socks, and immediately just got whole body tingles. And it came to me. No longer was it the success of my career. What am I in service to?
Yeah.
And I started calling clients and saying, we're going to finish your projects, but I'm shutting the firm down. And just full-time tarot. And took 5 years. Then that's when I got to the East Coast in 2015 to separate myself from architecture. Because 30 years of, under deadline, self-induced, self-immolation, talk about, 30 years of torture, that I went out to try to get more work. Well, that's trying to get more torture. There's good news, bad news. Good news, I signed up a project. Bad news, now I have to draw it. So
yeah.
But I think look at that, give yourself time, because on Friday I realized something was amiss. I'm incapable of seeing what it is. So I didn't, for the first time probably ever in my life, I didn't sit there and dial into, I'm going to reason this thing to death so I can, substantiate my position. No, that point was the first, I think, inkling consciously that I was on the disappearing path, and that I needed to give myself the nothingness of a silent weekend so I could actually hear the little tiny ding of some Tinkerbell tiny molecular thing ringing way across the universe to me. And in that sense, the star is eternal hope. So take a look at yourself and that, what are you in service to? And, now I'm on my 4th annual lease here in Taos, and, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And it looks pretty tidy now. But if I would not have taken that 72 hours to be devoid of reason and to be devoid of explanation, I wouldn't have taken the wheel of my own life. I would have just still been business as usual, but I would probably start getting sick because I was off, where I'm supposed to be. So I think that, what am I in service to?
Well, the silence is key. You have to start listening to yourself. And, there came a time I've mentioned before when at age 40, I turned off the radio in the car. I couldn't stand listening to it anymore, and I turned it off. And I've never been bored a moment in my car since then.
Yeah.
And
a visceral experience.
Right. And I suppose we'll leave it at that for today, but we'll continue.
Be comfortable with their not knowing. I think it's terrifying because I didn't, here's the thing. It was probably the first time in my life I finally didn't care a rat's if this was a smart thing to do, which means I shed the show pony. And no longer is it for everybody else's benefit that, oh, look, I succeeded. It wasn't about success. It was about service. And I think the service to the self-centered piece of my own center, And if I didn't nourish, not being egomaniacal, just self-centered, meaning I now have center. I'm aware of my center, my sun, sun, the bright identity. That's me. And how am I going to make the world a better place by me doing what I'm supposed to be doing? And I think, as Jung said, the greatest privilege of life is to find out who you really are. And I still don't know. And I'll keep not knowing and keep learning. And we'll see.
Yep. Right. And State of Awakening says, I had a similar experience when approximately 30, I turned off the radio and learned to hear God. And
There you go.
Richard says, I gave up rock music a few years ago and I don't miss it either. Well, which reminds me to mention a new movie that is out called A Complete Unknown. Have you seen it,
My
Jordan?
mom and I went. It's the second. My mom and I went on, I think, the day after Christmas.
And what did you think?
I thought it was one of the most developed, raw stories I have ever seen. Every character was intensely themselves, and I was getting angry at Bob Dylan and you're a dick and oh my, and she calls him that, and he goes, okay, I mean, so I had never seen such wonderful life with all the conflict and some betrayal, but put forth so naturally.
Yeah.
I think that the pace they didn't energize the new chapter with I'm gonna turn the music up louder, which means it's boring as hell, and I'm gonna have to try to rehook you. That story was told. I mean,
what I found is I remembered again that I didn't really care for Bob Dylan back
yeah,
in the day.
yeah,
And actually, I was at that same Newport Folk Festival the day before. Okay, the day before the final scene in the movie. I
yeah.
was physically there listening to Ian and Sylvia. And I drove back to school. I was in college at the time. I drove back to school and I called my girlfriend at the time, who did go to the last night, and she was telling me about this mini riot that took place.
Yeah.
And
wow.
And but I've long had wonder about the idea that the Nobel Committee decided to honor him with
Mm-hmm.
The Nobel Prize in Literature. And I
Which, of
remember,
course, he didn't attend the ceremony.
which he didn't attend. He didn't attend, which was classic Dylan. And what, and I learned from the movie why he behaved later, because about 5 years ago, there was a concert here in Annapolis, or right outside of Annapolis, at the Bay Sox minor league baseball team's stadium with Bob Dylan and Willie Nelson. And my wife and I went to that concert. I said, wow, those two big guys, and I've liked some of their music, so I think I'd like to go hear it. Well, we went, and Dylan had this huge speaker, I would say. Okay, I mean, it was truck size, literally. Uh, I mean, 18 wheeler size. And he was blasting out this music, and he never played any of his old favorite songs. And I was really upset because the acoustics, my hearing isn't red hot, and because I do have tinnitus. And I was kind of upset because the acoustics in the stadium were pretty bad. And he had this very powerful speaker or a set of speakers that involved, well, it involved essentially a semi-tractor trailer. And then he had his own bus to ride in addition to that. And when he finished his sets, I hadn't heard a single word that I understood in any of the songs. Okay. Um, and then Willie Nelson comes in, and he had this little amp that was
It's
set up for a lounge, right? And he's out in center field, and he's got this little tiny amp, and that would have been great in a lounge, right? In a Greenwich Village joint, but in a baseball stadium, you couldn't hear him at all. And so he did play some of his stuff, but you couldn't hear it at all. So it was a hugely disappointing concert. But I realized from this movie that it has always been a value of Dylan's. Not He refuses to play his old stuff. He
mhm.
only will play um, new music, and his old stuff. He says, "Well, I've recorded that. You can hear that.
Well,
You know,
and even the
I don't
scene
need to
Johnny Cash,
re-sing it."
where he's graduated from the mentor friend of the folk festival who really got him going and noticed, but now he's outgrown that, though there's still, he's kind of, a little petulant about it. But you realize that now Johnny Cash, even standing there drunk, is now his professional colleague voice giver. So when he looks and Johnny Cash goes and holds up the guitar, and holds up the guitar, meaning, yeah, go do it. It's okay. And up to that point, he wouldn't. And so that was his MO, though. And it's interesting. I saw Bob Dylan in it was either 1989 or 1990 in Lubbock, Texas, of all places. And, the I mean, I could not understand a single word, even less than I could from anything recorded.
Mm-hmm.
But I left with the feeling, wow, I really respect him for some odd reason that now I know he struck the place of creation. There was a certain raw, natural realism that didn't have anything to do with, capital
Mm-hmm.
G Greek reason, and but it is his MO where he never stops. He's not looking back. This is what I'm doing now. I don't want to be my own retrospective.
Yeah.
So he certainly wouldn't be the show pony.
Right. And so then, having seen that in the movie, that he never played old music, I then understood what he was doing at the Bay Sox Stadium, which was he was playing new music, which I didn't know,
Yeah.
and therefore didn't have any connection with. But I mean, the song that's really telling in that movie is "It Ain't Me, Babe," which
Yeah.
is he was who he was and always has been,
Mhm.
and he's actually relocated to Australia because he can't get any peace in the United States. Obviously, he can't be anywhere without being mobbed.
Well,
And
what's interesting about that too is up until 5 years ago, maybe, I always thought he was a Brit because he had this kind of punk attitude,
Mhm.
that he's just going to do anything he wants. And it's very, very, anarchist and punk rock theme. Um, and it's got to be 2 minutes or 3 minutes, and it's not about X, Y, or Z. But I didn't realize until 5 years ago that he's from the Midwest, like Iowa or Idaho or something,
Well, Minnesota.
Minnesota. Yeah,
Yeah,
so but that he was from the north middle of the United States,
yep.
farm I was baffled because I always thought because of the hard to hear what he's saying that somehow there was a different language accent that must be going on, and his attitude was so punk that like Sid Vicious or what have you, from the Sex Pistols, that he must be British. And it was so eye opening when I discovered my giant error that no, I'd assumed and never looked that wow, he's just some
Yeah.
American
The
guy.
other lyric was your sons and your daughters are beyond your command.
Yeah.
And that's still true today, very, very much so. I have to keep it in mind
And
as I
David
do
Bowie
my
has a
work.
lyric like that too. They their children quite understand. And
Surely. Well, it's been real, Jordan, and
yeah,
I just want to close for today, remembering once again Miles Flagg, my
yeah.
personal friend, who um, he, like the rest of us, Miles was trying to figure out what his life meant, I
Mhm.
think. And there was a time about 5 years ago, I would say, that Miles and I were very close, and Miles, just by his existence, um, made what I'm doing now and what Jordan is doing now possible. Okay, just by the fact that he was there and he was listening to us, and it was so important to me. And yet, from Miles's perspective, I know that he thought I was helping him, which I think that I did, um, but it was very much a mutual experience. And so I just want to remember Miles Flagg, spelled Flaig. I think you can probably still find him on Instagram um,
And
and
I
on social networking and see something about uh, his activities. I'm going to put his name here.
I had the same feeling, that he felt I was helping him, and I felt he was helping me. And his curiosity and his wonderment and his quirky activism that was his way. And I'm grateful for how gracious he was. That was there's true humility, which I felt made him a bigger person. And I have blessings of memories of just his experience. And there were certain things I remember he would say something and it would get under my skin a bit. And by the end of that afternoon, I would be smiling because he got me to dig out some gold nugget that was bothering me through all some expected, traditional, reasonable lore. And I have to next week thank him.
Yeah.
That really got me. But I would notice how gracious he was, and I couldn't not listen. And so I don't waste trouble. And I feel I learned and expanded actually because of his presence.
Right. So let me just look because I haven't looked as yet, but I suspect that on this YouTube channel, um, there is you can find uh, some reference to Miles
And
besides,
Miles is spelled Myles.
yeah, Myles. And yeah, here he is in many different things which he did over the years, and he was a big Toastmasters Club guy,
Mm-hmm.
uh, and so he's making comments about Toastmasters, and and so yeah, so there's a lot of good stuff here from Miles Flagg, and there are things from this actual channel that you can find. I'm not And so it, it might be worthwhile to go check out Miles Flagg and some of the things that he was doing, especially in the last few years of his life.
Blessings of,
So,
yeah, I have
yeah,
blessings from him.
yeah. So peace, everyone. We'll see you next week, and we'll endeavor to get through the rest of this essay, which is subtitled Shudder, Shimmer, Stammer, and Solitude.
Have a great week.
Take care now. Bye-bye.